And my congratulations to David Mann for being instrumental in instituting this lecture as a means of bringing the university and the town closer together, and he tells me it's worked. So my congratulations to the Mann family for continuing to support it. Little need for me to introduce the parameters of the discussion tonight. This topic has been hanging around on the national political landscape like a smelly cat for decades. Some would say more than 100 years, but certainly it's focused attention over the last couple of decades at least. As a political journalist for more decades than I care to think about, my mind has become numbed over the years to the countless meaningless picture opportunities of politicians in hard hats, politicians in surgical gowns, politicians holding dead fish and holding shovels, you name it. But I do still have a very clear image of Bob Hawke and Graham Richardson standing on the banks of the Murray somewhere planting trees. And Bob Hawke promised that there were going to be 1 billion trees planted. And the theme then, I think, was salinity. And let's assume that there was at least some genuineness to that policy and that there was some worth to that policy, but it was also a vote-catching exercise because Graham Richardson, as one of the strategists of the Labor government at that time, had come to the view that the only way Labor could win the 1990 election was with the Green votes on preferences. And so they were chasing the environmental vote very substantially. And I suppose, I'm not taking a cynical view here, I'm taking more the view of the healthy sceptic, which I would urge on all of us rather than the cynical view. Those two things have always gone hand in hand, and I'm sure they're going hand in hand today. The issue of votes and the issue, hopefully, of something approaching good policy. We've now got the Water Acts of 2007 and 8, the product of two other governments acting and needing to be seen to act on the serious decline of the Murray-Darling Basin environment. Nice round numbers, 10 billion, 10 years from John Howard and Malcolm Turnbull that became 13 billion under Kevin Rudd. We've now got the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. We've had a politically disastrous first attempt at a public consultation on the way ahead with the guide to the draft plan. That's still a very strong memory for you, Barry, I would imagine. Resulting in a whole bunch of angry and worried irrigators, some bemused scientists and suspicious environmentalists as the government went back to the consultative drawing board. So next month we're expecting to see the authority's proposed basin plan mapping out the road ahead over the next 7 years, starting 2012. Seems to me La Trobe has timed this discussion to perfection, involving some of the key players in the whole debate, although in the end it's the Parliament that will determine the final blueprint. Is it too much to hope that it could not only be the right outcome but possibly even a bipartisan one? Who knows? I'll briefly introduce the panel and we'll get down to it. Professor Barry Hart is in the thick of it. He's a member of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. And I'm going to be asking him to shed some advanced light to the extent that he can on the proposed plan, which is due out next month. He's now an emeritus professor at Monash University and previously was director of the Water Studies Centre at Monash and deputy director of research at the CRC for freshwater ecology. Dr. Neil Byron is an adjunct professor at ANU's Crawford School with a background in environmental and resource economics. In fact, he tells me he's an adjunct professor at 5 universities scattered around the 4 corners of the globe. He was Environment Commissioner at the Federal Productivity Commission for 12 years until last year, conducting 17 inquiries, including the National Drought Relief Policy and water buybacks in the Murray-Darling Basin. Danny O'Brien is CEO of the National Irrigators Council, formed 3 years ago to represent the interests of irrigators at a national level. Danny is a former journalist, but don't hold that against him. His most recent role in that regard, he's also advised politicians, but don't hold that against him either. His most recent role in that regard was as former Deputy Prime Minister Mark Vail's senior advisor. Most recently he was Communications Manager at the Rural Industries Research and Development Corporation. Steeped in rural Australia, I think we can say, Danny. And finally got another job. Dr. Arlene Harris-Buchan is the Healthy Rivers campaigner with the Australian Conservation Council. She's the ACF's lead negotiator on the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. Arlene also sits on the authority's Basin Community Committee and has a background in science and law. Dr. Ben Gawn is the director of the Murray-Darling Freshwater Research Centre, co-located on La Trobe's Albury-Wodonga campus. Ben has built an enormous knowledge base on the ecology of the Murray River system over the past 14 years at the Research Centre, with special interest in lowland river ecology, flow ecology, aquatic invertebrate ecology and primary production and decomposition. I fall under the last category. The logical place clearly to start is with Barry Hart. So Barry, what can you tell us about what we can expect from the proposed plan?
I think what you will expect in a few weeks' time will be a very different document than the guide. I think Kerry did a pretty good job of summarising what wasn't done very well. The Basin Plan will, I think, be quite different in the sense that we now have some different parameters. I don't know whether people have caught up with the fact that the Basin Plan, again, provided it goes through a government, the initial Basin Plan will be constituted in 2012, probably in the first half of 2012. And then there's been a decision to ensure that all of the requirements of that Basin Plan will be finished and placed by 2019. So there's a very different situation than occurred several months ago. And I think it's really good in the sense that it does allow for a much more reasonable transition between the plan, which is going to set out a framework, and where we need to get to by 2019. Doesn't mean that things won't be occurring within that period of time. But so could I just summarise what, again, we're trying very hard to get in place a process. I should back up. The Basin Plan, if you only worked through the Water Act, which is an interesting new set of legislation in 2007, 2008, and that you've read all of the discussions about whether it's only talking about the environment or whether it's triple bottom line or optimisation, all of that I think hopefully is in the past. Look, there's no question that we are talking about a rebalancing of the water allocations in the Murray-Darling Basin. The way I see the Act is that the most important part of that is that it put the environment on pretty well a level footing with consumptive water. And there's all sorts of other things that you can read into it. You can read it as a very prescriptive Act, and I'm sure we'll have some discussions about that. But what I wanted to just indicate is broadly our thinking at the moment as to what will be the process. We have certain, within the Basin Plan, we have certain things that we are able to do. There's a much bigger canvas that involves both state and federal government departments and the community. And that's going to definitely be in the new Basin Plan. So the process that we're seeing that we'll have laid out in a few weeks' time broadly involves 5 steps. What we're seeing 2012 really as being a starting point, the initial Basin Plan. Remember, this is a hopefully not something that's going to suddenly occur and everything's been done and we'll walk away from it all. It'll all be done. No way. This is probably a 30 or 40 or whatever period of time to do it. So the 2012, the Basin Plan will establish the starting point. Doesn't mean that there hasn't been lots of things going on in the past. I think that's the first point. The second point is that and you've again seen in the press, lots and lots of discussion about whether the Commonwealth, with their $9 or $10 billion, is doing a good job, an effective job of getting water back for the environment. So we'll certainly be seeing part of our role as assisting the Commonwealth in identifying effective strategies with their investment portfolio, buybacks and infrastructure. We're definitely working and will be, during that period, that transition period, a lot more with the states and with local communities, particularly catchment management authorities, who I think are going to be very, very important in terms of the implementation and the running of the allocations of the water. Obviously, we've got some knowledge gaps, and we probably want to talk a bit about the science, Ben will, in the past, because there's been, again, a bit of controversy about that. So there's obviously going to be some additional research, investigations, additional modelling in that period of time. And probably most important is that we really are talking about, in the jargon, I'd call it a paradigm shift. We're going to have a relatively very large amount of additional water for the environment. But it's within, particularly in our southern system, Murrumbidgee, Murray, Goulburn and so forth, we're talking about a system that has, for the last 80 years, primarily been run and organised for consumptive water. Now we're saying, hang on, we've got this fairly large amount of environmental water, but it's got to be used within a framework that's probably absolutely not optimal for distributing it to wetlands and floodplains and the like. So I think there's going to be some really major shifts in the policies that are around at the moment, which are very largely focused on very efficient, and look, the irrigation industry is very efficient, but it doesn't mean that the rivers are run in the best possible way for the environment. So we're hopeful that we can put in place conversations with state governments, with the general community, about some of the changes that might be needed, for example, in terms of some of the rules, some of the ways in which the rivers are operated, some of the rules about how much you can carry over in reservoirs, some of the environmental works and measures that might make it a bit more efficient to water wetlands, those sorts of things.
I think some of what you're talking about now we'll probably tease out over the whole of the hour. But there's one question that I think has to be asked early in the piece, Barry, and that is, we know the reaction in parts of this region to the guide to the draft plan, and we know that a new chairman came in as a result of that. We know that new chairman, and I'm not casting any aspersions on Craig Knowles at all, but we know that new chairman came from a political background. We know that there's a nervous government in Canberra that felt it needed to fix a problem. Why should there not be a suspicion in at least some of the stakeholders in this whole affair that what we're now going to be looking at is an even more compromised political outcome? And I'm asking you this as the scientist member of that.
Yeah, well, in other words, you're saying have the original numbers, if you like, been watered down? I think I'd have to say to you, no. There's certainly
so we're still looking at 3 to 4, are we?
There's certainly a lot more development of the science and the modelling. It's pretty well known that the original modelling that was used for the guide was very cursory, very broad brush.
But haven't you overdone that now? How many models have you got?
No. That's basically it's one model. It's one model of a series of hydrological models. It's more really about the process that we're going through, which is about identifying what's the ecology of the basin that we really want. Okay. And that's largely prescribed in the guide. There's a fair bit of wriggle room there, but basically that's it. You've got to work out, the Australian community's got to work out first up, what sort of basin do they want? Okay. And then it's how much water to achieve that.
You talked about the ecology of the basin. Ben, this is your field. How have you felt as a scientist about the scepticism expressed about the uncertainty of the science itself being questioned?
Well, I mean, there's no doubt that there is uncertainty around the science. So over the last couple of decades, the evidence has been accumulating that the way that we're managing the river is having a detrimental impact on the environment, and our understanding of our relationship with the environment has matured so that we now understand that the environment provides a foundation on which we build the quality of life and the productivity of our agricultural enterprises. And so undermining that foundation will have long-term consequences for the quality of life of all people dependent on the resource. So that's the essential foundation. And so we got the science to the point where we could make a compelling case that there's a rebalancing required if we're going to protect the values that people are sort of articulating through the signing of international treaties, through a lot of analysis of the values that people say they want from these systems. But then the policy change came in and we said we're going to have this basin plan, and that pushed the science into a whole new area of asking us some very difficult questions about what are the water requirements required to achieve these particular values or maintain these particular values in the system. And there's no doubt that there is some uncertainty around that.
Does this come back to Barry's brief mentioning of the criticism that this plan and that the Act is too prescriptive? That and that are you finding yourself or yourselves as scientists that the questions are being put to you by policymakers or bureaucrats or planners who want some kind of clearly defined, simple, black and white set of parameters so they can fashion a nice, neat policy around it?
Yes, of course, everyone would like a nice, simple number that you can work around. But as soon as you start getting into the management of flow in Australian systems, where it is just so incredibly variable, the whole idea that you could come up with an average number that you can work to is nonsensical. And even once the SDL is sort of declared, then there's a whole bunch of issues about what that actually means on a year-to-year basis. But in some ways, the Water Act
So there is the broad sustainable diversion level, the SDL,
Yep.
which has been 3,000 to 4,000 gigalitres, but will probably be less, Barry. But that then is broken down to a series of smaller SDLs for different regions of the basin.
For each valley, yes. And I mean, one of the things about the Water Act, and one of the reasons that the science has had such a hard time responding, is that the Water Act was very ambitious in its commitment to best available science, and also some of the things it was asking for protection for. So it didn't just say biodiversity, because that was something that we'd been working on up to then. It also included ecosystem services. And that's really a very new area for us. So as scientists, we're going, well, how much water do these ecosystem services require? And when there's a lot less certainty about that, ecosystem functions is also an area of great uncertainty for us. And the last one, which is incredibly important, is resilience. That is maintaining and protecting the system's capacity to recover from disturbance. If you're going to be managing these systems, that's an absolutely fundamental issue for these systems. And yet, because resilience can take, the capacity of the system to recover could take decades in some cases. We as scientists don't have a good handle on that, but we've been trying to inject that sort of science into the calculations for the Basin Plan, but there's going to be uncertainty about it. But with all these natural resource management issues, we have to accept that there's uncertainty, just as there's uncertainty around the social and economic side of things, but that shouldn't stop us acting. We have to come up with an estimate and accept that at some point in the future we'll revisit that with improved knowledge and an assessment of what the Basin Plan's achieved, and revisit the issue and then perhaps revise the water for the environment either up or down, or get more sophisticated about the way we manage it. So it's an ongoing, evolving process in which we're injecting the best possible science into it at this point.
Well, you're one of those who believes that nothing like the proper resources have been poured into the science, into the research and development. Is there any sign, as a part of this new world that we're heading towards, that there is going to be more than lip service paid to research and development, so that in fact your knowledge base will genuinely grow?
Well, we are in constant conversation, and my understanding is that the Basin Authority is now looking at what their research needs are going to be to enable them, well, both the Basin Plan is going to have a monitoring and evaluation plan associated with it, which means they've made a commitment to monitoring the success or otherwise of the Basin Plan in its implementation. Now, in a perfect world, that would line up very closely with a research program, so the two programs would add value to each other. So at the end of the system, at the end of the review period, we'd be in a position to say, well, this is the progress that the Basin Plan has made, and these are the reasons it's either succeeded or not met our expectations, and that would then inform the next iteration. So my understanding is that there is going to be a commitment to that, because I think all the people who've been working on the Basin Plan within the authority have become only too well aware of the limitations of the knowledge in trying to apply it to the challenge that they've been set.
Okay. Now, yeah, just briefly.
If I could add to that, what will come out as the proposed or draft Basin Plan will be the draft legislation that I'm sure everyone will be riveted to read. There's a requirement in the Act for a simple English version of it, which is
Who's
boring.
writing that?
Boring. No one will read that. We're putting out, I think, a pretty readable document, which is really espousing what the Basin Plan's trying to do, why is it needed, and what are the broad implications of it. And then there'll be a series of additional documents that go to a lot of the detail. For example, many people want to know how the heck, if you're going to end up with a large additional amount of water, how are you actually going to go about using that effectively and efficiently? That will be spelled out. So getting to the point about research, there will also be within those documents an outline of what we see being needed by way of research and investigations over at least the next, the period between 12 and 15. There'll be a break point at 15 where we would hope there's a whole series of processes, both additional knowledge, additional input coming in from community groups. There'll be lots and lots of ideas on environmental works and measures, identifying what they might be, which could save some of the water. They will hopefully all be packaged up and put into a series of amendments. One of the problems.
Well,
no, I'll come to that later.
We'll have to keep the thing flowing,
sorry.
Barry, but I'm sure you'll have the opportunity to drop these explanations in as we go. And of course, the umbrella over all of this is that federal government in Australia, the average political cycle of a government is something like 2 years and 4 months. So every 2 years and 4 months on average, we have a change of government. And of course, there are state governments in this up to their eyeballs, and they're changing all the time as well. We've just seen a new Victorian government come in, a New South Wales government come in. So, you know, the hope that if you do come, imperfect beast though it may be, that you actually come to a document and a plan and you're going to proceed wonderfully down the road, you've got to hope to hell that there's a bipartisan approach from government to government. Danny, you come to this acting for irrigators, obviously. They're why you're here. And I notice in reading your own kind of draft pitch that you acknowledge the needs of the environment and you say you want to give back to the environment. But when it all boils down, your primary interest is irrigators, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. I think we say, though, I often say we support having a healthy river because we rely on it more than most. But it's got to be in balance, and we've always argued that there are optimum levels of environmental health, and they need to be balanced with the optimum levels of food and fibre production, but also the interests of the communities that rely on the river. And
who's going to strike that balance? Are you content for the Murray-Darling Basin Authority to strike that balance?
No, and that's no disrespect to Barry and the MDBA or Craig Knowles. Our very strong view is
a little bit.
No, our very strong view is that that this is not a technical question, not something that can be answered technically, that the sharing of water resources is a difficult social and economic question as well as an environmental one. And so we certainly think that the best available science should inform the decision, and it should inform what the MDBA comes up with. But that ultimately it does need to be a judgment call by elected politicians, because there are so many difficult things to deal with, and ultimately it's the Parliament that should make that decision, and in this case it'll be Tony Burke attempting to shepherd it through the Parliament. That's if it makes it through before the government changes, which we expect it will.
How confident are you that this is going to be a bipartisan plan by the time it goes through?
I'm not necessarily confident that it is, but that's certainly one of the things that we're working to, and we've spoken to the opposition and to the government about that, and I think that that's how it should be, and I think my members would like to see a bipartisan commitment. I guess we've long accepted that this was a bipartisan approach. The Water Act. Ironically, Tony Windsor was the only member of the lower house that voted against the Water Act. Didn't vote, yes, on the first iteration, but 150 of them supported on the amendments in 2008. So, you know, I think
it was a sacred cow that everybody had to be on board with at that time, didn't it? Both sides of politics.
Yeah, it was a bit, and I think that's where the drought comes in. There did become overriding political considerations for it, and you know, I was pleased that both yourself and Barry referred to the long history of this. There's sometimes said that, you know, we need reform. We haven't had any reform. We've been having reform for decades, and that certainly in the last 2 decades, there would barely be an irrigator in the Murray-Darling Basin who hasn't lost water to the environment, and mostly uncompensated.
So, Arlene, you're the opposite end of the pole to Danny in the sense that you're here to protect the environment in your view, but you, as he says, he cares about the environment, you care about the irrigators. But fundamentally, I mean, you've got the authority through the science arguing for 3,000 to 4,000 gigalitres back to the environment. Let's say it ends up at 2.5. You're still out at the far end, aren't you? I mean, you're still that's still light years away from what you ideally would want.
Oh, well, look, I mean, everybody knows that for decades we've taken far too much water out from the rivers of the basin. In less than 100 years, we have increased our extraction levels by 500%. So absolutely, we support the Murray-Darling Basin as our food bowl. It's important that we have food and fibre production through this generation, through next generations, and as far into the future as we can see. But the levels of extraction that we are currently subjecting the basin to means that the health of those rivers and wetlands is in steep decline. And of course, rivers and wetlands and the environment, it's not just about native birds and native fish and native trees. It is about those things, but it's also about protecting the natural resource base that underpins all of our agricultural industries, all of our irrigation industries. So agriculture relies on healthy rivers. And that is why it's in everybody's benefits to fix this problem. As you said, it's been hanging around for decades like a smelly cat. It's time to get rid of that big problem. It's time to put the environment and the industries and the irrigation economy of the basin onto a sustainable footing and really put this to bed forever. It's not in anyone's interests to delay the process of change any longer. The longer we wait, the harder the problem becomes, the more expensive and the more difficult it is to fix.
So how confident are you of an outcome that ACF, that environmentalists can live with?
Well, I think coming back to Barry's point and your efforts to get a number from him and keep going, because you never know, he might crack.
Well, we'll know soon enough, but I think we can safely say it'll be less than 3.
But that is...
Well, maybe that'll be the upper parameter.
But the really important thing here is the environmental outcomes. It's the environmental outcomes that we have to achieve to protect and restore the environment and to underpin our irrigation, our tourism, our other industries across the basin. Now, those outcomes do rely on reallocating a big chunk of water from irrigation back to the environment, and then doing a whole lot of other things, land-based management, rules and that sort of thing. But the key to this is the openness and the transparency and the honesty of the authority in being really clean about its data, its methodology, its modelling, and demonstrating how the numbers that they come up with will actually achieve those outcomes. And that is something that we didn't see in the run-up to the guide or with the release of the guide. The environmental outcomes weren't clear. It wasn't clear how those outcomes were tied to SDLs. There were big gaps there. So, and we haven't yet seen it in the run-up to the draft. And I think that's something that the authority should address really, really quickly. This ongoing lack of transparency about what they're doing in there and what it will mean for the environment, for irrigators, for South Australians, continues to breed a sense of suspicion.
Okay, well, I'm going to hold you to a yes or no answer here, Barry. Is it going to be substantially more transparent?
The next version?
Yes.
Oh, absolutely.
Good.
And we're talking lots and lots of talk to do. Oh, it has to be, Kerry. You gave a very good analysis of what wasn't done well in the guide, and definitely that was it. It was too complicated. it wasn't explained well, etc., etc.
Right, okay. Now, Neil, I've read one paper of yours where you argue that the whole process is flawed, deeply flawed.
Yes.
So what are the key flaws?
The whole process of the creation of the MDBA, built into the Water Act, the buybacks, the engineering works for improving irrigation, is all based on the premise that you can achieve much better environmental outcomes and world-class agriculture and sustainable, prosperous communities using just one lever. How much water are you allowed to take out of the rivers? That's just crazy. Even getting the right environmental outcomes across the basin using just that one policy lever is basically impossible. But if you're also trying to achieve social and economic outcomes as well, I mean, it's just too much. And the basic design flaw, I think, is that it was the whole exercise of fixing the problem of the basin, whatever that was. They hadn't done the diagnostics. How did we get into this mess? What are the options for getting out of this mess? It was just whacked together in 15 minutes on a Sunday afternoon, and we're going to fix whatever's wrong with the basin for $10 billion over 10 years with a 10-point plan without ever working out what do we need to do and how to make it work. Let's do some planning, let's do some legislation, let's do some buybacks, let's build some more irrigation infrastructure. Why was the buybacks $3 billion out of $10 billion? Who knows? Where was the logic behind that? Where was the feasibility study? Where was the diagnostics? And so the people who've been trying to write this plan have been working their butts off, but they've basically been given not only a very, very difficult task, but it's been set up as if a couple of hundred people in a room in Canberra with a really great big computer can work out exactly what's the right amount of water to be in the river system on any given day of the week for the next X hundred years. It's impossible. However, if they had talked about it, set it up as how do we move forward towards that, sustainable environment, sustainable communities, world-class agriculture, we would have been engaging with the catchment management authorities, with the land care groups, with the local municipalities. We would have talked to all those people who've got a lot of skin in the game rather than isolating them because we've got some computer models to run in Canberra. You would have built up a consensus document from the grassroots rather than trying to decree some engineering outcome from the top. But there's an arrogance in that Water Act that said, the states have stuffed all this up. We, the feds, are going to come in and fix this whole mess, for $10 billion. It's really, really only when you start to unpick and say, well, geez, what do we do and how do we do it and how do we make it work, you suddenly say, well, hang on, that wasn't the right way to start.
Yeah, but that's not going to be reversed, is it?
No, but what will happen now is that when the draft comes out, whether it's tonight or in the near future, there will be, I will predict, a fair amount of continuing disagreement about whether the social and economic dislocation it will cause is worth the environmental outcomes, whatever they are, because there's a lot of people who aren't convinced that we'll actually achieve all those environmental outcomes that might be agreed. And so this will end up going to the courts, and the legislation will be, the politicians will decide, well, the courts have ruled it should be this. That's not actually what we meant in 2007, 2008. We're going to have to revise the legislation. It'll open the whole can of worms again, and we'll be still sitting here discussing this in another 10 years' time. I'm sorry.
Gee, terrific. You are a critic of the infrastructure side of the equation, aren't you?
Yeah.
So you would have it that to the extent that water has to go back, that could and should be achieved pretty much solely through buyback?
No, not solely, by whatever means are the most cost effective. But to spend,
Just very quickly, why is infrastructure ineffective in your view? That is, making the infrastructure of the irrigation system more efficient so that it retains more water.
The people of the irrigators in Colliamberley did this brilliant system a few years ago, which is what the Northern Victoria Irrigation Refurbishment Program is based on. But those irrigators paid for it themselves, because it made sense to them. It was a way that they could get more irrigation water out of it. And they did it. It wasn't taxpayer subsidised. They did it. It installed state-of-the-art efficient systems. But the Victorian scale up of that is going to cost taxpayers $2 billion. And the question is, are we getting $2 billion worth of social, public, environmental benefit out of that? I've no doubt that the irrigators who stay there and who are still getting serviced off the channels, the lucky ones, will think that they've won the lottery. But there are...
Will they have won the lottery?
Some of them. And others will have the exact opposite, that they will find that the channel that they were on has been disconnected because it was too expensive to service. But to think that the key to spend $6 billion out of $10 billion to get a better environment, better agriculture and better communities, to spend $6 billion of that on concrete and engineering works, it's like saying, well, here's a bucket of money, but it can only fit one thing. Many of those communities and irrigators can think of much better ways of spending that money to get much more environmental and productivity outcomes. But they've been told they have to spend it on concrete.
But Danny, you're not one of them, are you? You're a strong supporter of that, of the infrastructure aspect.
Yeah, and we are.
Do you believe that the balance is right in terms of the actual money that's been allocated thus far?
Well, I think so, but there is a misnomer out there about the balance. It's often cited as $5.8 billion, and the Sustainable Rural Water Use and Efficiency Infrastructure Program, SWRP as it's known, is $5.8 billion. But when you actually drill down into that program, there is $3.4 billion available for irrigation efficiency water savings projects in the Murray-Darling Basin. So, as a bucket of money often is with politicians, it's been pilfered for a whole lot of things, including the annual costs of the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder for the next 7 or 8 years, $200 million. $200 million for strengthening basin communities. So, for a start, it's not...
But Neil would still say it's inefficient.
Yep. The second part of it is our very strong view is in terms of the wider community benefits. The investment in irrigation infrastructure allows irrigators to keep producing at least the same amount of product with a whole lot less water. And that means that the downstream benefits for the truckie that picks up the milk, the person that works in the rice mill, the bloke that works in the winery or the cotton gin, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker in the local community still has that economic activity going on in their community with a whole lot less water going around. And I think that's the key argument for it. And I know
subsidised by the taxpayer.
Yes, and I'll come to that in 1 second. I know there's sometimes an argument from some of Neil's colleagues that it should be better spent on what the community wants, because the community might think it needs a TAFE for a hospital. Well, frankly, if the community needs a TAFE for a hospital, it should have nothing to do with water reform. They should be getting that TAFE for the hospital. Now, the subsidisation of the community by the taxpayer. The final point I'd make on that: Victoria is a classic example. Government-owned infrastructure, and government hasn't invested in it in the past. It's been allowed to run down because it hasn't been invested in. And equally, I mean, many of the New South Wales and South Australian irrigation districts are privately owned now, but equally they were established by governments in the first place, and only in the last 10 or 15 years handed over to private non-profit ownership, I should add. And I think it's important to recognise, and Barry used the term paradigm shift before, there's been a compact with irrigation communities and rural communities over 100 years. Go out, go forth, develop irrigation, develop the inland, build communities, build industries. And in less than a generation, governments have gone from that to saying, oh, no, we don't want you to do that. Irrigation's bad. You've got Collyambly was mentioned before. Collyambly is the newest town in New South Wales. It was only settled in the 60s and 70s, and it is entirely an irrigation town. It was developed on the back of the Snowy scheme. And now you've got government saying, and the wider community saying, we've changed our mind, we've gone too far. That's where we argue, well, there does need to be government taking responsibility for those decisions and helping those communities to adjust.
Do you also believe, as a matter of principle, that once a town has been established and has survived over a certain time and has built its own culture, its own society, that it should be allowed, it should be supported to continue to function into the indefinite future?
I don't think that, I don't think anyone would say that, Collie has a right to survive. But I do think that there is a responsibility of the government and the wider tax-paying public to acknowledge that, in fact, in Collie case, a government decision created it, and now a government decision is going to impact on it. Then there should be some assistance for that community to adjust. And I think that there's varying degrees of impact. A place like Albury-Wodonga, even Shepparton, which is probably much more reliant on irrigation, they'll survive through this process. They've got big enough scale and they've got other industries and the like. Shepparton, the recent EBC report indicated Shepparton will be hurt by it. But there are many places that are reliant on irrigation. That's their reason for existing, and that's their good land and water.
If that is inefficient, and that is their reason for existing, should they continue to exist?
Well, I'm not arguing that they have a right to exist in perpetuity, but they should at least have the assistance provided to go through that adjustment process.
Okay, Neil, quick response.
Which part? Communities...
He agrees with everything.
No, he doesn't.
Rural communities in Australia have been changing continuously since the end of the days of Cobb and Co, when little towns no longer needed to exist every few miles to change horses. There are a lot of drivers for social and economic change in rural Australia. There's a beautiful book by friend Neil Barr, The House on the Hill, which I'd urge you all to read, about change in rural Australia. A lot of people are thinking, oh, it's all because of the plan, or it's all because of the water buybacks, or it's all because of something else. But in fact, this process of change has been happening for a long time and will probably continue for a long time. And I think that it's much better to allow the community, again with skin in the game, to take control of how their community is changing, rather than having somebody in Canberra decree how it has to happen.
Okay. Now, to come back to a point that you were touching on earlier, Ben, when you're talking about amounts of water that need to be returned to the river systems, it's different amounts of water in different places, isn't it? But if you've got this overall figure of whatever it's going to be, 2, 3, whatever, you can't apply a prescription, can you? And you've written this, and I think you've touched on it too, Arlene, that you can't take a particular wetland, and say, well, the scientific ideal for this wetland of water that needs to be returned in particular ways and particular times is this amount. So we can't have the optimum outcome here. We've got to compromise. So we'll put half the water back and we'll get half the outcome. Now, that's not the case as far as you're concerned, is it?
That's part of the challenge, is we don't know what the relationship is between returning water and the amount of environmental improvement. In a nice world, it would be you double the amount of water in for the environment and it doubles its condition. It becomes twice as healthy, if you like. But we're not sure whether that's the case. And there are almost certainly, in some cases, thresholds that you can put a certain amount of water back and get almost no improvement, cross the threshold and you'll get a major improvement. So we're not sure about that. So we have to base our estimates on the information that we have about the water requirements of usually a few species, and sort of say, well, if we look after, for instance, red gums, then all the species that are reliant on the red gums are likely to be okay as well, and base our information around that. But part of the issue is that Australian, and particularly in the Murray-Darling Basin and the rest of Australia, are very variable systems, and so having an average allocation of water isn't a particularly satisfactory position to be in either, because you don't want to be telling the managers put 10 gigalitres in this wetland every year, because that would probably end up with being damaged as well. But in some ways that's a really powerful and creates opportunities, because the environment can be a flexible user. During droughts it need not have as much water as it might take during a wet period, and that may actually create opportunities to trade water between the environment and consumptive use, which would actually help increase the reliability of agricultural water supply. So we need to move into that space where we don't put water within silos. We actually have the environment needs this sort of water or this sort of regime, and there can be some exchange between the environment and between consumptive use to try and optimise the outcomes. But that's going to require some quite sophisticated institutional arrangements to negotiate the transfer of water between those two things, while achieving that optimum both for the environment and for agricultural production.
Neil?
I'm really interested in that because one of my concerns is that a lot of the environmental problems that we think need to be fixed aren't fixed by just adding more water. And I've even been told of some cases where adding more water may actually make the problems worse. And yet there's the presumption in there that not only is the only thing you need to fix up the health of the basin to add more water, but the more water you add, the better it'll be. And yet there are lots of examples where that, if part of the problem is that rivers are filled with European carp, changing the amount of water coming down the watercourse isn't necessarily going to fix that problem. So that very naive notion that I think is built into the Water Act is just add more water, you'll fix it, and the more water you add, the better it'll be fixed, is just not consistent with the science as I understand it. Ben?
I wanted to respond to your point before where you were sort of saying that we don't need this planning process, we need to have a more regionalised approach where communities get carriage of that. And in some ways I absolutely agree with that, but I don't necessarily think that we don't need a planning process. I think we did need to set some overarching sort of balance between consumptive use and the environment, although once again I'm arguing that should be a permeable sort of and flexible sort of demarcation. But I think it's actually the challenge is going to be in the implementation of the Basin Plan that the true test will be there, because as you said, the thing that was missing from water management was the overarching basin scale coordination of activity. And so there's no point having one local landholder or CMA trying to do something with water if their activities are completely undermined by what someone's doing either upstream or downstream. So you do need that overarching coordination. But as you say, there are a whole bunch of stresses that we've put on these systems and they all need to be addressed. But if you don't address water, you're not going to fix any of the others. But in undertaking the implementation of the Basin Plan, it actually creates an opportunity for engagement with state and local bodies to actually start addressing some of these things, to say the Commonwealth is going to manage the water, this is the bit that we're going to do, we would like you to take care of some of the land management issues or the invasive pests and weeds, and actually give them a clearly defined role and take some ownership of achieving the overall environmental outcomes. Because I agree with you 100% that it isn't just about water, but I would say that if you don't fix the water, you're not going to fix some of the other things.
But what if we had a system where the CMAs had to talk to the one upstream and the one downstream and negotiate what the one upstream is going to pass on to our area and what we, in turn, are contractually committed to make sure that the people downstream, not only in quantity, but in variation and in quality, in pH and temperature and sediment loads and all the rest of it. And just arguing about the number of gigalitres really doesn't help. I can think of an institutional regime where you could actually use all those local skills, but hook them together. And they'll all add up to a basin plan, but it's not one that's imposed from on top.
I'm going to come to you in a moment to address this, Barry, but a quick response from you, Ben?
I'm not sure about the optimal institutional arrangement. I'm not sure that anyone around the world is, but I mean, in principle, I agree that there needs to be clearly articulated roles for the Commonwealth and the federal government, the state and the local, even down to local landholders. So you need to clearly articulate their role and promoting communication between them so there is that coordination. I'm not sure about the best way to do it. It's not my area, but in principle, I don't disagree, but I still think that the Commonwealth is going to have a role in the management of water because there will need to be that basin-wide coordination. It's not just catchments, sorry.
Now, we're going to come to questions from the audience in a moment, but I want to talk to Arlene and Danny just briefly. Now, Danny, every time you hear a scientist like Ben acknowledge an uncertainty in the science, do your members see that as an opportunity to jump on it and say, well, while there's this uncertainty, give us the benefit of the doubt? To what extent should the environment also be given the benefit of the doubt?
Well, I think
beyond just lip service.
Yeah, I think Neil outlined before one of the problems with the Act. We just discussed that issue on the fact that it's all about water. But the Act actually says use the precautionary principle. And my members are very frustrated, particularly after the guide, why is the precautionary principle not being applied to them? And I would argue that the environment is extremely resilient. Many of our rural communities are very resilient, but I'd suggest that the environment is more resilient and has better opportunity to bounce back. So I think our argument should be apply the precautionary
But there is
principle.
a tipping point, isn't there? You'd have to acknowledge in various aspects of the environment there are tipping points.
That's right, and for both. There are for communities as well. So, and again, it's not necessarily linear. You might say, oh, you take out 20% of the water, that has a 20% impact on economic production and jobs. Probably not. If you get to 25%, you might lose all the industries. So I think that comes back to the balance question.
Okay, Arlene?
I might just say to Neil, your vitriol about the Water Act and the institutional arrangements that we currently live in is right on so many different levels. But we did come, there's a reason for that. We came from a particular place where, you know, for 20 or 30 years we've recognised that, you know, we take out too much water and so on. And there was an ongoing situation of lowest common denominator decision making from the states. It was a race to the bottom, you know, parochial decision making where everyone downstream blamed everyone upstream. Everyone upstream thought if there's a drop of water goes past my farm gate, it's a waste. So you're right that there are so many things wrong with where we are. But there is a reason why we got there, and it was to try and deal with that parochial lowest common denominator decision making. That is why the Commonwealth eventually said, we've had enough of this, we're going to take this over ourselves. But one of the sort of, you know, almost unforgivable outcomes of poor negotiations during the negotiations of the Act was when the state said, well, you can't have anything to do with land management. And then the decision to use international conventions and so on to enable the Commonwealth to take control of what they could take control of is what's resulted in this ridiculous division of land from water. We've spent 50 years as a society and a community working at that integrated catchment management, integrated land and water management is the way we need to manage our land and water resources, which comes down to the, well, how about if all your CMAs work nicely with each other, we would get there. And we've thrown it out the window and tried to separate them, which is ridiculous. And the issue with the CMAs as well, they're so often bodies of the state. And an ideal world would have those CMAs or equivalent NRM bodies doing exactly what you say, but they need to be properly empowered to be able to do so. They need to have that element of independence from their governmental masters. They need to be properly resourced and have the independence to make those decisions under particular terms of reference that don't mean that as soon as a government changes, a particular lever gets pulled and we're back to where we started.
Or a person gets replaced. Or an authority gets replaced. Barry, just briefly.
I just had 2 points. One was, look, we've got an Act. Yes, there are all sorts of things wrong with it, and yes, it'd be lovely to have it very differently constructed. We've got it, we've got to make it work. That's where I am. That's where I'm sitting at the moment. And I think that if people keep carping at the Act all the time, then we're not going to get to where we need to. Second one was with respect to transparency. There's a whole... The authority's been challenged very much by trying to interpret what the Act says and use best available science, as Ben was pointing out. But ultimately, and this is where the transparency comes in, I don't think we've done a very good job here. Ultimately...
You mean here tonight?
No.
You mean your transparency?
No. In terms of the guide?
Right.
No, as I said, it'll be much, much different. There are judgments. There are huge numbers of judgments. We could have interpreted the Act and said, oh, well, you know, the Act is really saying we've got to get close to pristine. No way. That's not an interpretation that we've taken. So there's been evidence and then judgments, and we need to make very clear where we've made judgments and what evidence that was based on. I mean, we've made a judgment that we really should be putting a line in the sand, and those wetlands and forests that need to be, even though they've been enormously contracted over the last 100-odd years, we need to protect and maintain and rehabilitate what we've got now. That's a judgment. We could have said 80% of what we've got now, or we could put out to the community, see what people are doing. So there's the science, but there's also very much a set of judgments, which we're testing.
Okay.
We put it out there.